Thank you for joining us. My name is Molly. I am the Adult Programs Manager here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and we're so grateful that you're joining us for this Mornings with O'Keeffe program today. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I'd also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support makes events like this possible. If you're not yet a member and you're interested in joining, please visit our website at gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. For the duration of the lecture, the chat has been disabled. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum's website in about 2 weeks, where captions in both English and Spanish will be available. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this morning. We have joining us Dr. Janet Revell Barrett, the Marilyn Flaterer Zimmerman Professor Emerita at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And we have Yaritza Martinez Pule, who is the Curatorial Assistant here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And we are thrilled to learn not only about a new exhibition that's here at the museum now from Yadi, but also from Dr. Barrett about some wonderful intersections between Georgia O'Keeffe's life and the art of music. So without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Yadi.
Thank you all. And Dr. Barrett, if you could, wonderful, share that introductory slide. I am Yadi Pule, for short, and I curated this exhibition, and A Circle That Nothing Can Break explores how Georgia O'Keeffe imbued shapes the circle in particular with emotional symbolism. In 1915, O'Keeffe began experimenting with circular forms, establishing the shape as a dominant motif in the constellation of her work. By addressing the circular forms that propelled O'Keeffe's abstract visual language, as well as the fundamental writings of Vasily Kandinsky and Alon Bement's experimentation with musical analogies and synesthesia, this exhibition sheds light on O'Keeffe's systematic use of organized circles and their kin as potent conduits for conveying emotions, lived experiences, and philosophies about abstraction. Including watercolors and drawings never exhibited during O'Keeffe's lifetime, the combination of works featured delves into a vitally significant theme and timeline whereby O'Keeffe engaged with organized circular forms in the 1910s through the mid-1940s, and again in the 1970s as her life took a new direction following damage to her center field of vision. With this, I will segue to the wonderful Dr. Barrett, whose research unraveled the ways in which music offered O'Keeffe possibilities for discovering expressive shapes.
Thank you so much, Molly and Yari. I'm so honored to be here. I would like to start this morning with a little imaginative exercise. We've had a slight technical glitch that Zoom and my computer are not talking to one another, but we're going to take an imaginative time travel journey where I'd like for you to think about a musical example. The year is fall 1914, and Georgia O'Keeffe has been teaching art in both Virginia and South Carolina, and at 27, she's recently enrolled in the art department of Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. And as she walks down the hall, her attention is heightened by the sound of music coming out of an art studio. In fact, I have a wonderful clip of Pablo Casals playing a sarabande from a Bach cello suite, but since we can't hear it, I'm going to ask you to think of another really familiar cello melody, which is Saint-Saëns' The Swan. If you can have in your mind, da 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 dum ba da, 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 da. So have that in your mind. Pardon, I'm not a cello, obviously. And think about O'Keeffe walking down the hall, hearing this music, and being compelled to walk in the room. There are two accounts I've found of this exact moment, very compellingly related. This one that comes from a wonderful book, Some Memories of Drawings. O'Keeffe says, walking down the hall of Columbia University Art Department, I heard music. Being curious, I opened the door and went in. The instructor was playing a low-toned record and asking the class to make a charcoal drawing. And so she sits down and makes a drawing. And then the instructor plays a different kind of record, a sort of high soprano piece. And she notes that the two pieces were so different, you had to make two quite different drawings. Paired with this description of O'Keeffe's is drawing number 14, which she says is the one that she made at the time, and that it gave her an idea that she was interested to follow, the idea of lines like sounds. And so in this drawing, you'll note the strong black lines, the medium values in square shapes, and the scallops lightly bordering the central image. But the title of this talk is actually taken from another account. This one from another sort of illustrated autobiography that came out in 1976. Here, a lot of it is the same, but you'll note, I bet you're not seeing, there we go. I bet you're not seeing the full thing. She says, I never took one of Bement's classes, so now we know who the instructor was. And then the rest of the account is very, very similar. But note the ending of this passage. This gave me an idea that I was very interested to follow later. And more poetically, I like this phrase. The idea that music could be translated into something for the eye. So that's the origin of this talk and the inspiration for this idea of the way that O'Keeffe drew from music in her art practice and painting, drawing, and also watercolor. And here it's paired with a painting that comes later on in this story, Music Pink and Blue, obviously in oils. So the phrase captures what for me is an imaginative bridge from music to art. It also goes the other direction. From art to music, music to art, the bridge can be traveled. And before we set out into more about O'Keeffe's story, I'd like to explain how I got interested in early abstractions of O'Keeffe. Here's a marvelous photograph of Georgia O'Keeffe standing in front of one of my favorite paintings, amongst others, but she's standing in front of blue and green music on one of her frequent trips to the Art Institute. This photo was taken in 1967. Just a few years later, in 1971, I visited the Art Institute for the first time at the age of 16. I grew up in Southwest Iowa, where I was immersed, just surrounded by music all in my life and my family and my school experience, but not many encounters with art. And so somehow I asked my parents to take me to the Art Institute on a family trip. And I remember vividly being drawn to blue and green music, first by the title, but then by its dynamic presence. And I was just bowled over by O'Keeffe's work. And for me, this encounter was a crystallizing experience with art. Later, I went on to become a music teacher rather than an art teacher, which O'Keeffe did for a while. And I made the transition from teaching elementary and secondary school to teaching college and university students, and in particular, preparing music teachers to do their work in schools. Over time, I noticed how music teachers make the most of their precious time in the classroom with students. And understandably, they prioritize music first and foremost. But all around us, there's this cross-fertilization in artistic circles, a vital force in creative expression to travel across art forms. And so I've been inspired for many years to explore the rich relationships of music to other subject areas, and also to encourage music teachers to explore those relationships, hoping that they in turn will invite their students to make these wonderful connections. And so on the right-hand side, you see I recently published a book that develops this theme. And so it's really an honor that this book came to the attention of the museum folks, and they asked me to do this presentation, which I'm so happy to do. I asked myself a question: what evidence can be gathered from the prodigious scholarship of work on O'Keeffe? And you understand that I'm not an art historian, but I have immersed myself in lots of that literature, and also the artistic milieu of the early 20th century, to support the idea that music could be something for the eye. Was this an original idea of O'Keeffe, or were there other things going on? So in that regard, I looked at various forms of evidence and inspirations that would support this broad, wonderful transitional idea. Amongst those, we'll look briefly at O'Keeffe's musical involvement and interests. We'll take a moment to pay tribute to her influential teachers, Alon Bement and Arthur Wesley Dow. We'll travel for a moment to her reading, and especially, as Yari was talking about, the work of Vasily Kandinsky, born in Russia, doing much work in Germany, back to Russia, and finally ending his career in France. Then we'll look at art created by others in the Stieglitz circle who were known to Georgia O'Keeffe, and her work was also known by them. Then we'll look at correspondence between O'Keeffe and her close friend Anita Politzer, and later on speak briefly about her correspondence with Stieglitz that supports their interest in music. And finally, at the end, speak a little bit about O'Keeffe's word use, and in particular, two terms, specials, and how she used the word music, which I learned over the course of my exploration was very particular, very specialized, and very idiosyncratic to the way O'Keeffe thought. So we'll consider these influences. I'm concentrating on her early work, when she was really called to abstraction more and more, and in the period particularly between 1916 and 1923. And then at the very end of the talk, I'll take just a moment to take a brief look at the way that musicians have been influenced by O'Keeffe, which could be another wonderful talk, I'm sure. There are many quotes of Georgia O'Keeffe that you run into time and time again. They're cited frequently. And one of them that I keep falling into is this marvelous quote from the New York Sun. "Singing has always seemed to me the most perfect means of expression. It's so spontaneous. And after singing, I think the violin. Since I cannot sing, I paint." You might take from that quote the idea that because she couldn't sing, she solely focused on her painting. But actually, music is a thread throughout her life, certainly throughout this period. And there's more about the violin that we need to know. She was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, if you know the territory. Her mother, Ida, was a gifted pianist who could play songs by ear once she'd heard them. And she often gathered the O'Keeffe children around the piano after dinner for music making. She gave the children music and drawing lessons. And her father was known to play Irish airs on the violin. So she grew up in a very musically rich household. It was also rich with art, though, as well. And so at the age of 12, her mother sent Georgia and some of her sisters to watercolor lessons in Sun Prairie. And at that time, she was known to announce, will be an artist when I grow up. But her accomplishments in piano and violin were still a very strong part of her life. In fact, she was known to have said, "I can't remember a time when I couldn't read music." She spent a year in a convent school in Madison, and we can imagine, I looked at the publication, the Etude, which is for music teachers, that she probably played Clementi's sonatinas on the piano and Bach on the violin. Later, her family moved to Williamsburg, Virginia, where she was enrolled in the Chatham Episcopal Institute. And the account there from her sister Georgia was that her attentions were equally divided between art and music until the end of her second year at Chatham. This would be equivalent to her high school years. She studied both piano and violin, and Catherine said she played beautifully. She liked art very much, and she liked the other two, but she couldn't go on in both. She wasn't smart enough for that, she said. Well, we're going to take account of that because as her life story unfolds, we'll see that she really did not abandon musical involvement at all. She had some additional artistic training at the Art Institute of Chicago, attended the Art Students League in New York City, and did some work as a commercial artist and some high school art teaching. But eventually, she took a summer course from Alon Bement in the summer of 1912 at the University of Virginia. And this was really a turning point in her thinking. We already love Alon Bement because he uses the Victrola in his teaching. So he gets stars from me. But he recognized O'Keeffe's promise, and he freed her to pursue her own ideas rather than to follow the prevalent practice of imitating or drawing in the style of the Europeans. If you remember that image from Columbia University, you saw the plaster casts of statues, and copying those was frequent in that time in art education. But turning away from Europe worship, Alon Bement encouraged her to follow her own artistic path. He also encouraged her with prompts. He would give her books and periodicals to read and exhibitions that he thought she should see. Later on, he asked her to serve as his teaching assistant in subsequent summers, and he opened up recommendations for her to teach at Columbia College in South Carolina and at a West Texas Teachers College in Canyon, Texas. Bement was in turn inspired by the work of Arthur Wesley Dow, who had been his instructor. And Arthur Wesley Dow was inspired by Ernest Fenollosa, a curator of Japanese art. The importance here is that Dow was very strong in turning away from the practice of European art worship toward more spare lines of Japanese art. And he was also very drawn to music. He said that the spatial arts, drawing, sculpture, and painting, could be thought of really as visual music. He didn't invent that term, but that term really took hold in O'Keeffe's imagination. Some of his key teachings that O'Keeffe internalized was the advice to fill space in a beautiful way. He asked his students to harness the power of spiritualism and expression through principles that he taught and captured in a very well-used composition textbook. And you'll see some of these flower compositions that later O'Keeffe used when she was a teacher of teachers to encourage her own students to crystallize and distill their expressive and artistic ideas. So these two influential teachers were slightly different in her life. Bement as her mentor, giving advice, recommending influential sources, opening doors for her. And Dow was more a model of aesthetic sensibilities, the use of line, color, light and dark. And he also was committed to compositional principles that O'Keeffe later would experiment with in variations in her own work and in her teaching. We've mentioned Kandinsky several times, and Kandinsky is himself a fascinating person, so inspired by music. He wrote this treatise called Concerning the Spiritual and Art that was widely read at that time. And this is a lot of text on the screen, but the key thing is that he said, at this moment in time, the arts are working at what they're best able to say in the language that's peculiarly their own, but they are approaching each other and they are learning from each other in this phase of spiritual development. And I've highlighted in the second paragraph a wonderful phrase that I gravitated toward, that as the various arts are drawing together, they find in music the best teacher. And so the reason I think that music was such a draw is that music in expressing inner feeling was, as he says in the last paragraph, the most non-material, the least representative, more abstract at the time than much of visual art was. And so the artists were drawing from the abstraction of music as a touchstone in making their own expressive capabilities less representational and more abstract. Kandinsky's art is phenomenal, and O'Keeffe saw paintings of Kandinsky exhibited in New York. And he is famous for saying, and listen to these analogies, color is the keyboard, the eyes are the harmony, the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. We know that O'Keeffe read Kandinsky's treatise multiple times, and she was inspired by this reading to explore these analogous relationships. Kandinsky titled many of his pieces either compositions or improvisations. So the art world at this time was playing with this notion of music as inspiration, but realizing it in very different ways. I want to share two quick examples of persons in the O'Keeffe circle. And these people knew O'Keeffe and she knew them, and they were familiar with one another's art making. So one is the artist Arthur Dove. Arthur Dove is notable because he took particular pieces and tried to turn those into a visual representation. On the screen, we see two representations, two paintings by Dove. Well, actually, one's a collage and one's a painting of Rhapsody in Blue, George Gershwin's marvelous piece that heralded a bridge of the classical genres with the jazz age. It is said that Dove's wife, the artist Helen Torr, would run about searching for recordings of Gershwin and Stravinsky that he would play as he painted. And in the piece on the left-hand side, the one that's a collage, it may be hard to see in the reproduction, but there's actually a clock spring in the middle that starts in coiled fashion at the bottom and goes to the top. And one of my clips was the opening of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue with that lovely clarinet glissando, which I always think about when I think of that piece. And so he was also inspired by Paul Whiteman, Irving Berlin. He had a piece called Swing Music that was an homage to Louis Armstrong. And he worked in creative ticker tapes, like long pieces of paper filled with notations transcribing musical rhythms. So think how closely that idea of mirroring music in painting was captured by Dove. He was an admirer of O'Keeffe, and when he saw some of her work, he remarked to Alfred Stieglitz that O'Keeffe was able to accomplish what Kandinsky's trying to do. Another painter in this circle is Stanton McDonald Wright. Look at the titles of these two paintings, and you might think that I have misspelled something, that I meant to say symphony, and instead I have written synchrony. Stanton McDonald Wright had a theoretical impulse that, like symphonies of sound, art could be a synchrony of color. And indeed, he was working on grouping like colors and unlike colors and stacking them in ways that music and composers and performers stack vertically sounds like chords. He said, painting is just as capable as music of conveying the greatest delight and sense of happiness. And he was also bowled over by Georgia O'Keeffe, seeing some of her watercolors and remarking to Stieglitz also, O'Keeffe isn't painting, she is beginning a new art. So you can see that this idea of music as something for the eye was shared by many, but realized by O'Keeffe in a particular way, which we're going to see here in a minute. I learned so much in my exploration from O'Keeffe's correspondence with Anita Politzer, and it makes me think, why don't we write letters like that profusely to people back and forth every day? Their letters back and forth, they started a friendship at Teachers College in 1914, and they had an incredible correspondence that captured a lot of O'Keeffe's emphases, her curiosities, her struggles, her experimentation. And through this correspondence, I learned more vividly how O'Keeffe used and continued to play her violin, and not in a way to just take a break from her art, but in sort of a chain where she would take something from her experience, oftentimes an image from nature, and play around with it on her violin that then would turn into a visual moment in her drawing or painting. So look at these two quotes here from South Carolina, where Georgia is teaching music teachers, by the way, and boy, would I love to know more about that. She writes to Anita, it's a wonderful night. I've been waiting to tell someone about it. I've labored on the violin till all my fingers are sore. I imagine I could tell about the sky tonight if only I could get the noise I want out of it. I'm going to try to tell you about tonight another way. I'm going to tell you about the music of it with charcoal, a miserable medium for things that seem alive and sing. Later, she writes to Anita, I've just been trying to express myself. Words and I are not good friends at all. I've been slaving on the violin, trying to make that talk. I wish I could tell you some of the things I've wanted to say as I felt them. In this crucial period, Georgia O'Keeffe was using charcoal, and it was in an attempt to sort of distill and crystallize and get to the center of these expressive moments that she wanted to capture, using circular shapes, light and dark values. You see in the left-hand painting that has music in the left-hand charcoal that has music in its title, those undulating lines that we'll see again. On the right hand, number 12, you see this distinctive plume that some have related to the scroll on stringed instruments. Pine calls this one of her signature motifs. So obviously there's an affinity with nature as well. But in her correspondence with Pulitzer, she describes how she'd work on multiple versions of these drawings, working to really hone in on the shapes and lines and forms that carried feeling for her. And she even called them musical compositions that she'd been working on. These drawings are some of the ones that she rolled up and sent to Pulitzer, who was in New York. And some of you who studied O'Keeffe's life will know that this was the catalyst for the transformative moment where Anita Pulitzer, having received this set of drawings, runs off to 291 Stieglitz's gallery and shows it to Alfred Stieglitz, who later, of course, we know, becomes her mentor and her lover and her husband and her lifelong companion. And so this in itself is a remarkable story and worth following and telling. But this morning, unfortunately, we can't tell the whole thing. It is widely described. But this is the moment when Stieglitz sees these, he exclaims, finally, a woman on paper. And over the next few years, begins to exhibit O'Keeffe's work until she becomes recognized in these circles in New York, artistic circles. O'Keeffe continues to pursue abstraction, but at some point she turns from charcoal to the color blue and works in blue before she continues into more vibrant and varied watercolor palettes. But you'll see here, there's still that fascination with circular forms, with spirals, with emergent shapes, with color. And in the exhibition, which I will have to come to Santa Fe to see, I'm sure that I will discover more relationships here. Shortly after that, she began to work in oil. And these two paintings, of course, are notable because they're both titled Music, Pink and Blue, and Music, Pink and Blue 2, oil and canvas. And these paintings are ones that lead to a story of the reception of her work. These paintings were exhibited shortly after Stieglitz had had the exhibition of his own photographs that showed incredible images of O'Keeffe's face and hands and body. And at the time then, that led to rampant interpretations of her work by critics as primarily being about the female form and genitalia, which of course she pressed against and quite strongly that was their interpretations and not hers. But later on, we'll see in this story, she said in 1924 that time, and it's a fascinating time to learn more about her, caused her to turn toward work that she said was very much on the ground. The next one, a subsequent exhibition had two abstract things, but all the rest were objective. Images of alligator pears and calla lilies and apples. Roxana Robinson, one of her biographers, calls these images orificial. And when I see them, I leap ahead to the marvelous New Mexico period where the pelvic bones, we see the sky through the bleach bones. And so you can have that visual analogy. Until that turn, however, we see her sonic awareness from, just a minute, I'm seeing an odd thing here. Okay, from inspiration through music to representation. Here's a series that comes from her time in Canyon, Texas, and called From the Plains. And notice how she's drawing from an auditory sense, From the Plains was painted from something I heard very often, a very special rhythm that would go on for hours and hours. And that's why I painted it. From experiences of one kind or another, shapes and colors come to me clearly. In another passage from this same moment in time, she says that she discovered by running against the wind with a bunch of pine branches in your hand, you could have the pine trees singing in your ears. And she wrote about the cattle lowing. She said to Anita, I like it and I don't like it. It's like music. I made up a tune to it this morning. And she called some of the compositions of this period songs. So we can really see that relationship of music to her art. This is shortly the time when we come to blue and green music, which was one of my first introductions to O'Keeffe. And of course, the title sets up for me the notion of some sort of duet, a duet of blue and green, a duet of shape. Look at that strong compositional V in its bold black and blue, and how it frames the lyrically moving center and the soft rise and fall of those parallel lines in the lower left-hand corner, which always look to me like music. And when I visit this painting in the Art Institute, I'm not very far from Chicago where I live, I think about how as concert goers, we return over and over to hear a piece that we know quite well, but to encounter it anew. And that's the feeling that I get when I go back time and time again to blue and green music. O'Keeffe's 1923 show at Anderson Galleries featured many of these abstract works in charcoal, watercolor, and oil. And Lines wrote, every work in the show, whether realistic or non-representational, conveyed O'Keeffe's commitment to modernism. Here is her artist's statement from that show at the Anderson Galleries in 1923. And the key phrase that leaps out at me is, I found that I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way, things I had no words for. I think that her responsiveness to music was almost like, in O'Keeffe's practice, another medium, like watercolor or oil or charcoal might be. That it was a translational move in her feeling and thinking and artistic practice. It was really part of her voice. Again, from the correspondence, a couple other quotes I just had to put in here. Georgia speaking to Anita, again, you asked me about music. I like it better than almost anything else in the world. Color gives me the same thrill once in a long time. I can almost remember and count the times. It's usually just the outdoors or the flowers or a person or a story, something that calls a picture to my mind that affects me like music. And so what I was saying about music serving as a medium for her, I believe that allowed her to realize this next phrase, which is nothing is less real than realism. Details are confusing. It's only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis that we get at the real meaning of things. And if I were to have the chance to interview her or to observe her or to follow her around, I would wonder about this, if that is indeed the case. In the last few minutes I have to speak with you this morning, I want to travel the bridge in the other direction. How Georgia O'Keeffe's art has proven to be something for the ear. This is almost, just like O'Keeffe's work is inexhaustible, and so is the scholarship on O'Keeffe, so are the musical responses to her art. And I just want to highlight a few of them, and I wish we could have the time to hear them all. It's interesting to me, just like artists took the idea of music being something for the eye, and they translated it in such different ways. So do musicians, so do composers take O'Keeffe's art and translate it in different ways to music. So for example, this is a piece I've only heard snippets of, and I can't wait to hear the whole thing. It is a new sort of symphonic poem with singers called The Brightness of Light by the composer Kevin Putz. And it's based not on her art as much as it is the correspondence between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. And Renee Fleming sings the Georgia O'Keeffe part, and Rod Gilfrey the Stieglitz. The title comes from one of her first memories, that the first memory of light was a brightness of light all around. And it's been performed in Dallas and Chicago. I missed it, unfortunately, Kansas City and Boston. But the next performance, if you want to get your tickets, is in New York in May. Other composers have taken specific works, the watercolors from the Texas period in Canyon, Light Coming on the Plains, Canyon with Crows, and Starlit Night. Dan Welker has turned into a beautiful orchestral piece. I've just been fascinated lately with the Jennifer Higdon's trio for cello, flute, and piano called American Canvas. And she takes 3 different artists and turns her first movement is based on O'Keeffe, generally, stylistically, an homage to O'Keeffe. Victoria Bond writes a string quartet where she takes blue and green music and in 4 movements looks at blue and green, blue alone, green alone, and then dancing colors. So studying these relationships of composers' work based on O'Keeffe is really fascinating. To go back then to my original premise that I'm hoping that music teachers do this, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite examples. I didn't have anything to do with this. It happened completely independent of my tinkering, but I love this example. This is Chris Gleason, a band director from Patrick Marsh Middle School in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. He started a project called Commission Possible, where he commissions contemporary composers to write for and with middle school band students, which is pretty incredible. And some years ago, he asked the composer Samuel Hazo to write a piece based on Georgia O'Keeffe's blue and green music, which was premiered and performed by the students of Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, who up to the time that they were in middle school hadn't really thought much about O'Keeffe. And so they took a field trip to see where the site of her home would have been. The house is no longer standing. But then they went to the Milwaukee Art Museum and saw her work in person. I hope some of them were bowled over by it. And they also gave a concert there in the museum. So think about those connections. Think about the indelible way those experiences will remain with those students across a lifetime. It's the kind of thing that I've tried fostering with teachers in the book that I wrote. I talk about how pairing sometimes O'Keeffe's paintings with poetry based on O'Keeffe opens up another door to say, well, what music would go with this? To make sort of a triptych across music, art, and poetry. And so through invitations to improvise and compose, teachers have practiced that before trying that idea with their students. Back to O'Keeffe, in her later years, there's much now that we've passed over, but in her later years, she was known to have an extensive record collection. The people at the museum sent me the beautiful list of all of the recordings that she treasured. And of these recordings, she was particularly fond of Monteverdi. And I had a beautiful clip of a madrigal, so go find a Monteverdi madrigal and listen to it. A scholar that was granted permission to visit her at Abiquiu in 1972 when she was 85, she's not that age yet here, was told that she loved Monteverdi but didn't take to the music of the moderns. In her correspondence with Stieglitz, it's just peppered with references to the recordings they listened to, the concerts Stieglitz attended in New York and would tell O'Keeffe about, and their shared love of listening to music. And in the record collection, there's not only Monteverdi, but Gesualdo and Pachelbel, Vivaldi and Bach and Haydn and Mozart and Schubert and Schumann and some Stravinsky. It is really quite remarkable. When she came to the part of her life that her eyesight was troubling to her, and she continued to make art, but with assistance of people, assistants who would help organize her art materials. She still was drawn to those plumed, spiraling shapes, that unfurling, this iconic spiral and the circles that seemed embedded to me in her lifelong vocabulary of images, the things that she called special. And what came close for Georgia O'Keeffe to the way music moves without the need for words. So I think of lines like sounds, shapes like feelings, and music as something for the eye. There's so much to explore, and I am grateful to have been on this journey with appreciation to many people who gave me leads or materials or helped me find more about O'Keeffe's scholarship and her love for music, all of the miraculous things that have been written. But especially I love this portrait when Georgia O'Keeffe was a teaching assistant to Bement at the University of Virginia and teaching teachers to go out. And I feel an affinity not only through music, but an affinity for that kind of work that she did. So thank you so much. I hope that in your mind's eye, in your mind's ear, you had music in this presentation, even with our technical problems. And I appreciate your attendance and hope you have some questions.
Great, Dr. Barrett, thank you so much. That was so wonderful to hear, and the level of scholarship and just the enthusiasm that you bring to speaking about this is so inspiring. So on the behalf of the museum, I just want to thank you again for joining us today. And Yadi, I want to thank you as well for joining us and for speaking a bit about the exhibition that pulls a lot of these themes into the physical museum space. So very excited to move on to some questions from the audience. If anyone has questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A box. But to kick things off, I'd love to ask the both of you a theme that was present throughout this talk and also throughout the exhibition that Yadi has curated. I'd love to hear from both of you about the value of exploring these intersections between different art forms. We have this idea through both of your scholarship that music and visual art and also the sensory experience that we have as human beings, all of these things are wrapped up together. And I'd love to hear about why is it important that we think about things this way, especially when we're thinking about someone who had such a long and prolific life as Georgia O'Keeffe.
Thanks, Dr. Barrett. If you would speak to that, I think yes.
Well, for me, you can encounter her artwork, her drawings and paintings without knowing these connections. And you can derive a lot. You can gain so much from that kind of experience. But I've also learned, and for me, it's like an awakening. The more you bring the context of her life and the context of what was in the air, right? This time in the early 20th century when music was really seen as an opening. It was a way of exploring territory that hadn't been realized fully yet. And so that kind of partnership between and among the arts is fascinating to me. We live in a time now where that kind of cross relation happens a lot in sophisticated and circles all over. People drawing inspiration across different art forms. I mean, we live in an age of intersection, and we live in an age of interdisciplinarity, right? That it's not a new idea. That kind of cross-fertilization has been a part of artistry for a very long time, to different rates and degrees. But for me, the experience of the work is so deepened, so enriched, so illuminated by understanding that there are these other influences happening.
Totally. I think one thing that I will add to that, Molly, is and we talk about it a lot internally at the museum within the curatorial department and the art historians in the curatorial department and our fantastic library folks. That it's important, I think, to think about the sociocultural factors that are influencing O'Keeffe. And I think a lot of the time, there's a tendency to believe that artists exist in a vacuum, but there's so much happening around them that is influencing them. And I think when I was looking at some of the pieces in your presentation, Dr. Barrett, I was reminded of Ernest Bloch, and he had this photographic series where he was photographing trees and naming them after compositions by Bach. And I think about, that sociocultural movement that even Alfred Stieglitz was influenced by, where he's titling some of his photographic material after compositions by various musicians. And so O'Keeffe's abstract visual vocabulary, but especially the circular forms, are also influenced and multi-layered in that they're also pulling from music. Because I think music, as well as the shapes that she's talking about, are these pathways that allow her to express her emotions in a way that maybe she can't verbally.
I also think, as an educator of young persons, Georgia O'Keeffe was immersed in music and fascinated by art and wanted to do both, and found a way to make a life where those two influences were strong in her presence. And we have young persons in schools who don't want to choose a singular path, who want to have options that they can sustain for a lifetime in the arts, rather than having to narrowly follow only one route. And so that, for me, as a teacher of teachers and as an educator of persons, is really a compelling part of this story as well.
A little bit on maybe the other side of the same coin. We're talking about, musical influences happening, in the time and space in a sort of abstract way. But we also have physical evidence of Georgia O'Keeffe's a love of music, which includes her record collection and other resources like her stereo equipment that's in the Abiquiu home. And so would either of you be able to talk a little bit more about the actual physical objects that we have that tells us more about O'Keeffe's love for music?
I think both of us can speak to that. Dr. Barrett, you were working with our librarian, and so you got a lot of material sent, but I think physically, me having sort of seen her record player at her home in Abiquiu, I will just note that there's something really intriguing about it. For those of the folks on this webinar that haven't seen the actual record player, haven't had a chance to physically be in the Abiquiu space, O'Keeffe had this fantastic record player, and she had pieces of this yellowed tape that so it was controlling the volume and audio settings. So she had taped over it so that nobody could tamper with it. So she liked to listen to her music in a very specific way. And so I think just that part is so fascinating. And I wish, Dr. Barrett, that you could physically see that, because maybe you could speak to the mechanics behind experiencing music at a certain audio level with a certain sort of temperament.
Yes, preferences, right? We have preferences for the way we encounter music. We have preferences for the way that we encounter art. And what's interesting to me is, I mean, think about streaming now, how we stream music so readily and so easily, except on the computer this morning. But it's just amazing. And so O'Keeffe had this encyclopedic record collection, it looks like to me, when I look at all of the titles and composers and conductors and performers in her catalog, right? But imagine being able to journey wherever you want with streaming services, which we have. That also makes it interesting to me, Yari, about your preferences. Then it becomes important for us to curate what it is that musically, in addition to art, curate what it is that really gives us solace or enlarges our view of the world, speaks to us in the deep recesses of our identities. So that's a neat theme to consider in these times.
Definitely.
Great, that's so fascinating about this record collection. And Yadi, maybe you can mention a little bit about how in your curation process in the physical gallery space, music is making an appearance in your exhibition.
So one of the ways that I interwove music into the exhibition was by adding an additional layer to the audio tour. So folks have an opportunity to go into the exhibition. There's the opportunity to listen to me talk about the pieces in the introduction, and you can listen to the music tracks that I sort of selected for each piece. And so the exhibition has this wonderful quartet of paintings where all four kind of function as a grid. And you can analyze that spiral motif that Dr. Barrett showed in one of the early charcoal drawings, and then the how she returns to it in the 1970s in that red sort of spiral, sort of musical notation looking symbol that Dr. Barrett also showed in her presentation. And so anyway, I chose a quartet for that sort of grid wall. And then for her experimentation with circles and colors in the 1920s while she's living in New York, I chose music like Igor Stravinsky because she was also listening to Igor Stravinsky. So all of the music that I selected for the audio tour in the exhibition was music that O'Keeffe listened to and composers that she gravitated towards. And so that's one way that I interwove music, but another way is through the didactic material. And so throughout certain labels, you will see, the music as a leitmotif interwoven into the actual writing of the didactic material.
Thank you so much for diving a little bit more into that. And for the last couple minutes, maybe just playing a bit off of that theme of using multiple senses to, enjoy an experience like the exhibition or like the content of your talk, Dr. Barrett. We've had a few questions in our Q&A about synesthesia. It's a term that you've both brought up, and maybe we could spend the next couple minutes explaining how that term relates specifically to this context with Georgia O'Keeffe. And if anyone else has any more questions about that theme, maybe we can expand on that a little bit.
I can speak to that a bit. Synesthesia comes up quite readily in persons who are attuned to frequencies, more or less, across art forms, and who sometimes experience one art form in the fashion or the medium of another, right? So, for example, I was part of a performance of Scriabin's Prometheus, poem of fire. And Scriabin thought that different keys had different colors. And so there were laser projections of whatever key we were in. We would have these marvelous laser projections in color. There are persons who have that strong synesthetic sense, and synesthesia can play out in many different ways and in a range of sort of intensities. So I think you could say I mean, the closest I came to it in my thinking about Georgia O'Keeffe is this notion that was music for her was another medium, right? It was a way of taking her observations and her interactions with the world into her own sensibilities and then out through her artistic work. So that for me is a form of synesthesia, although there are many different forms and many ways this works. I will make just one quick recommendation. I saw at in Washington, D.C., a marvelous exhibition at the Smithsonian once called Visual Music. That was like a festival of synesthesia, right? And I came out of that so inspired and jazzed up that I could hardly calm down. So this is a wonderful reference for those of you who would like to think about that more deeply and see all the ways that that cross-art sensibility and experience can play out. That was a long answer.
So that's terrific. And, we are at time. However, I do want to just mention that we have so many amazing questions in the chat that I wish we could get to, including topics about artificial intelligence and what musical practices the both of you might be doing in your time. And so I wish we could get to all of these. I encourage everyone to please feel free. We will send an email, a follow-up email. You're welcome to reply back to me, and we can do our best to field some of these questions. But in the meantime, what I usually like to do when we end a talk like this is end with a remark from our Q&A about someone's experience being a part of today's program. And I want to share quickly what Tamara had to say, which was to say how much this talk has resonated with her as an artist who's been working with synesthesia for a few years. I wasn't aware of O'Keeffe or her influences, yet so exciting to hear. And so, and then there's similar comments throughout. So I just wanted to use that as a way to wrap up today and to thank you, Dr. Barrett, thank you, Yadi, for sharing so much about this, and to thank you for your work. And let either of you have a moment to have any last comments before we wrap up.
Just that it was an honor to be invited, and I can't wait to see the exhibition.
I will have to send you pictures, Dr. Barrett, in the meantime.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you, Molly, for everything.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And thanks for everyone for joining us this morning. We hope to see you at the next one, and be sure to come in and see the new exhibition, A Circle That Nothing Can Break, if you're in the area. Take care.